Hi, everybody. My name is Ben Rangel, and I'm on the Appalachia Audubon Board and the programming committee. So me and the other people on the team were instrumental in setting this up with Kathleen and others. So I'm here to introduce Craig Pittman tonight. And we're super excited to have him. I can tell everybody here is super excited to have him. I think a lot of his readers are here. Craig is a best-selling author, a podcaster, and an award-winning environmental reporter. He has 6 books about Florida. I think it's just 6. Maybe more. Good. Yeah, and several of those have become very popular. They're all very good. He has this engaging and humorous writing style that's informed by his journalistic background, and that makes a very effective means for promoting the issues that affect our beautiful but also very weird state that we live in. Tonight he'll be discussing the content of his book Cattail: The Weird Wild Battle to Save the Florida Panther. And he'll be talking about what he describes as a desperate experiment that led to the remarkable comeback of the Florida Panther. Craig?
Wait, so you want to flip this?
Okay. They're wiring me for sound.
And then if you want to put this on your belt.
Okay. Yeah, I don't do that, but
all right.
but it's the phaser set on stun. You're sure?
Yeah. And then you can just click through it as you're.
Okay. Okay. Great. Hi. How y'all doing tonight? Thanks for braving that horrible, horrible winter weather out there. I hope you found a good place to park your sled dogs. I can't get that attached. Hang on. I just want to mention you that was a very kind intro you gave me. I just want to mention 2 of my heroes are here tonight. Jack Rudlow, the sage of Panacea. And Jim Stevenson, champion of the Springs. These are the folks that made things happen around here, and you should be very happy that they're here and still doing what they do. So I'm going to talk to you about my book, Cattail: The Wild Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther, which is a story I wanted to tell for 25 years. And finally, I wrote a book that was a bestseller for the New York Times for like a week. And so then the publishers are like, "What else would you like to write?" I want to write the Panther story. So the Panther story was next, and it to me is sort of the Florida story as well because of all the twists and turns that it took. All right, let's see if this works. Nope. Okay. There we go. I'll just use the buttons. I'll just use the button. I'm good. I'll do it the old-fashioned way. I'll use my fingers. So the book starts with it starts here in Tallahassee, not your normal place you would expect to see panthers, but starts in the R.A. Gray building in downtown Tallahassee, where you find this particular figure, which I at first thought was a very bad sculpture. And every time I'd go by it, I think, man, this must be why they keep it up here on the 2nd floor away from all the other displays in the museum. But no, it turns out this is an actual panther. And in fact, it turns out the more I explored, the more I learned, this is actually the most important panther in Florida history. It's the one that changed things for all the other panthers. And it's just an amazing thing that it's there. And it's Florida Panther number 3 in terms of, they don't give panthers names, they give them numbers. This is Florida Panther number 3, and we'll get to its story in just a minute. Now, the early people who settled here in Florida, the Native Americans and so forth, they thought panthers were great. They believed panthers were like the first thing that the Great Spirit created, and they actually worshiped them and referred to them as the cat of God. And one of the archaeological finds, the Key Marco cat, shows the veneration that they felt for him. This is the Key Marco cat found on Marco Island. The upper half is a panther, the lower half was a woman, and this was a symbol of how venerated they were. The Spanish, when they came along, they called them lions. They'd never seen anything like this. there were panthers, panther species in Europe, but they'd all gone extinct by the time Spanish explorers came to Florida. So they had no experience with these things. The early American settlers who came here, they were frightened of them. They actually were scared of, and they called them lions and catamounts, which is a fun word to say, catamount. I just love saying that. But they were absolutely petrified that these things would come in and eat up all their cattle and their children and just wipe out everything. And so usually whenever they saw one, they'd shoot it. And there, if you go through the early literature of Florida's early settlers, you'll find all kinds of wild, crazy stories about people battling panthers hand to hand. You know, sometimes the panthers will jump in the middle of a wagon and they'll be battling while the wagon's rolling. And, you know, it's like a Michael Bay movie, but set in the 1800s. My favorite story that I found involves a woman who she and her husband were living in Central Florida in the late 1800s. She was pregnant, and her husband goes out to go hunting in the morning, and she thinks, well, I'll go over and visit my nearest neighbor who's 2 miles away. So she walks over to the neighbor's house. She's coming back close to sunset, and she hears a panther behind her. And so she starts to run because she's deathly afraid of this panther. And as she's running, of course, she's pregnant. She can't run very fast. And she hears the panther behind her. She thinks, how can I slow it down? I know, I'll throw my hat up behind me. So she takes off her hat and throws it. The panther stops to investigate the hat. She gets a little bit further ahead, but then the panther's behind her again. And she thinks, okay, what else can I throw? I'll throw up my blouse. So she throws her blouse behind her, and she's still running. The panther stops and investigates the blouse, but then keeps going after her. So she's like, well, I guess I have to take off my dress next. So she throws her dress behind her, and she's still running, and the cabin's getting closer, but it's still far away. And the panther stops to sniff at the dress, but then is back chasing her again. So finally she says, I just have to take off my underwear. That's all I got left. So she takes off her underwear and throws it behind her. That gives her just enough time to make it up onto the porch. She's in through the front door. She slams the door shut. She barricades it, and she's home. She's naked, but she's home, and she's safe. At least that's the story she told her husband when he got home and said, why are you naked? And the record reflects that he went out the next day and didn't see any panther tracks anywhere. Go figure. But here's the thing is, you know, the panthers, they're doing what panthers do. They weren't really chasing people around. Panthers were being panthers. You know, they were after the things that they eat. They were not eating people. They're eating deer and other stuff. But we didn't really know much about them until a guy I consider to be the original Tony Stark, Charles Corey, came along. Charles Corey was a playboy philanthropist scientist. He was fabulously wealthy. He lived up in the Boston area. He endowed several museums. He worked at several museum-related jobs for no pay because he didn't need to be paid. And whenever he felt the urge, he would go out and explore different parts of the world to hoping he could make discoveries. And so he decided he wanted to go see about these panthers he'd heard about. So he took a 90-foot houseboat and went down to Fort Lauderdale. His houseboat was very, very well stocked. It had a grand salon with a grand piano. It had a fully stocked kitchen with a chef and enough guns and ammo to start World War I. And so he went out every morning. He and his retinue, he and his posse, went out looking for panthers. They had a Seminole Indian guide, and the problem was they were looking for the panthers about 11 in the morning, and of course panthers are nocturnal animals. So for 2 months they couldn't find any panthers. They'd let the dogs loose at 11. I'm sure everybody was very well lubricated by then, and so, you know, they were having a good time, but they weren't finding any panthers. Well, finally, they stumbled on one that was in a tree. And Corey later wrote about how ugly the panther looked as it was snarling down at the dogs below. And he finally rode up and lifted his shotgun and fired and killed this panther. That's it in the picture. That's the panther he killed. And then he whips out a tape measure and starts taking measurements and writing notes, and eventually produces the first actual scientific identification of a panther. The thing is, he called it by a name that had already been used for a bobcat. And you can't do that. You can't duplicate. So another scientist who came along later actually named that ugly animal after him. It's the Puma concolor corii, named for Charles Corey. So he gets the pleasure of having that ugly snarling countenance on named after him. Now, a lot more people came after him to hunt panthers. They thought it was like hunting lions in Africa. So many people came here hunting them that they started to think, well, maybe we're not going to have them around very much anymore, which, believe it or not, actually made more hunters come here because they thought, well, I need to get my panther before they're all gone. That was the way the hunters were thinking. And so finally, in 1958, the Florida Game Commission, as it was called then, said, you know what? Enough. You guys stop hunting panthers. We're afraid they won't be around anymore. And so they actually put panthers off limits. But by then, there were so few of them that the only way you could see one was to going to various roadside zoos around the state in the 1950s. One of them was Ross Allen's Reptile Institute in Silver Springs. I believe that's the third Mrs. Allen. He was a multiply married scientist, holding a panther kitten and giving it a bottle, because that's what they did. They had these roadside zoos, and they had like 1 or 2 panthers that they would breed there. And that actually became important. There was a place in Bonita Springs called Everglades Wonder Gardens. It was started by a couple of ex-bootleggers from Michigan. I guess the weather got a little too hot up there, and so they came down to Florida for everything to cool off. And they liked animals. They liked especially reptiles, but they liked all animals. So they started this roadside zoo, Everglades Wonder Gardens, there at the terminus of the Tamiami Trail. So the Piper brothers, they have panthers, they have alligators, they have bears. If you've ever seen the movie of the Yearling, you have seen their bear. That's their bear in the movie. They filmed it on location in Silver Spring. I'm sorry, in Cross Creek. And when they turned the bear loose, all the dogs that the movie people had brought ran away. And Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings was there watching all this. She said, you need some Florida dogs. So she rounded up some dogs from her neighbors, brought them the next day. And this time when they turned the bear loose, the bear ran away. It took them 3 days to get it back. So, but they had panthers there. And so Everglades National Park, when it opened in 1947, discovered, oh, we don't have any panthers in the park. So they actually wrote to the Piper brothers in Bonita Springs and said, can you give us some panthers? And so they said, sure, we got plenty. So not once, but twice, they trucked panthers over to the Homestead area, to Everglades National Park, and turned them loose, which ended up becoming important later on. Now, you may not know this, but the Endangered Species Act was co-created by a Florida man, a guy named Nat Reed, who grew up in the Jupiter area. His mother said he was actually emerged from the womb with a fly rod in his hand. And he was devoted to the outdoors, to Florida's wildlife. And when he became Deputy Secretary of the Interior during the Nixon administration, there were already reports of species that were vanishing. So he got together some like-minded scientists there in the Nixon administration, and they went out for Chinese food, and over their Mugu Gaipan started jotting the notes for what became the Endangered Species Act. And they actually got it passed. And he also persuaded Nixon to cancel a proposed airport that was going to be built in what became the Big Cypress Swamp, which was also an important step because that was panther habitat too. So thanks to Nat Reed, we have the Endangered Species Act, and the first endangered species list included panthers and also included manatees, key deer, and alligators, believe it or not. Alligators were actually endangered at one point. Obviously, they're a big success story for the Endangered Species Act. Nowadays, we have the Statewide Nuisance Alligator Program, or SNAP for short. So anytime anyone tells you bureaucrats don't have a sense of humor, tell them about the SNAP program. So the endangered species list comes out, and everybody's like, oh, okay, well, we'll keep an eye out for them. Except Florida Game Commission officials said, oh, you're too late. The panthers are already extinct. We don't have any more panthers. Florida's all out. Except for the ones in the roadside zoos, they're all gone. Well, fortunately, the World Wildlife Fund did not believe them. The World Wildlife Fund let word go out that they were looking for a hunter who would track down if there were still panthers loose in Florida. And the guy they hired was a legendary Texas hunter named Roy McBride. Roy is quite a classic character. If you've ever read Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Crossing, that's actually based on a trip that Roy took to Mexico to capture a wolf who was preying on sheep there. And so Roy agreed to bring his dogs from Texas to Florida, very, very different terrain. You know, he's used to desert and mountain in Texas, and he comes to Florida and he's in the middle of the swamp. But nevertheless, he turns his dogs loose, they sniff around, and he found one very scrawny female panther near Lake Okeechobee. And he found signs that there were others. Not a lot of them, but there were others. They were still alive. And so he turned his findings over to the World Wildlife Fund. They turned him over to the State Game Commission. The State Game Commission said, fine, we'll have to figure out where they are and how they live and what we can do to protect them. So they picked a guy named Chris Belden to be the Florida's first panther coordinator. Belden was knowledgeable about bears, and they figured, well, one big predator is just like another, right? One big mammal is just like another. You're a bear guy, now you can be a panther guy. Belden was very, very diligent. He went back to Roy McBride and said, show me how to find panthers. And so Roy trained him, and then Roy actually brought his dogs back over to Florida to help him track down where the panthers were. And Chris Belden traveled around the state talking to people about where they might find panthers. And everywhere he went on his search, newspapers wrote about him. Sometimes he wrote op-ed columns for the paper. Sometimes it was stories about how this crazy guy was going out looking for panthers. And whenever they would run a story, they would run a photo of these beautiful, sleek animals. And it caught the public attention. People really were into these panthers, which a lot of people didn't know existed in Florida because they were so rare. About that time, a guy named Ralph Turlington, maybe you've heard his name mentioned in reference to a building here in Tallahassee. Ralph Turlington was the state education commissioner. Ralph Turlington thought it would be a great idea if Florida school children picked a state animal. And so he drew up ballots and sent them to all 67 counties. And on the ballot, it listed alligator, manatee, panther. And I think he figured it would probably end up being the alligator. But school children went nuts for the panther. They loved these stories about the panther. They loved the pictures of the panther. Panthers were cool. After my book came out, I actually talked to somebody who told me that in their school, their teacher had actually designated certain kids to speak for specific animals that were on the ballot. So he said, I was there to speak for the alligator, somebody else was there to speak for the panther, someone else for the manatee. And they voted in droves, and the panther was the clear winner. There were some write-ins for monkeys, by the way. I just want to mention that. Kids being kids, you know. And we do have monkeys here around Silver Springs. So then Turlington sent that information over to the state legislature and said, here's what the kids picked. Please ratify it and make it official through the legislature. Well, there was a lawmaker who balked. He said, everybody knows the state animal is a gator. Why would you pick a panther? Because nobody sees panthers. They didn't have internet back then, so there weren't emails, but he was inundated with angry phone calls and letters from parents saying, how dare you try and overturn what the kids did? And so the legislature went along with it and agreed to make the Florida panther Florida state animal. They actually brought in a panther from one of the roadside zoos for display when the legislature voted on it. And if they hadn't done this, if the kids hadn't picked the panther, I think the panther might have gone extinct. The state would not have been quite as invested in saving the panther if it had just been another predator. But because it's the state animal, well, you don't want to lose the state animal. That's like losing the keys to the governor's car, right? You don't want that to happen. That would be embarrassing. So by this point, Chris Belden has assembled a team of people to try and track down panthers and put radio collars on them, because they figured that was a new technique that a lot of biologists were trying out west. And he said, well, let's try it here with these panthers too. He had figured out that they were mostly down in the southwestern corner of the state, down below the Caloosahatchee River in the Big Cypress area near Lake Okeechobee. But so they would track down a panther, and they were using Roy McBride and his dogs. That's Roy in the gray cowboy hat right there. And they would track down a panther, and then they would shoot it with a tranquilizer dart and knock it out. And then they'd take measurements, they'd write all kinds of notes, and then they would put a radio collar on it. This is a picture of the very first panther they captured, Florida Panther #1. The woman grinning at the camera, her name is Deborah Jansen. She was not supposed to be on the Panther team, but she volunteered. And she's still working on panthers today at the Big Cypress National Preserve, all these years later. So they go out and they're capturing these animals. They're putting radio collars on them, and then they're using the radio collars to track where they live, what they eat, you know, what kind of refuge they have. Do they ever meet other panthers? What happens then? Yielding all kinds of great information. Unfortunately, the batteries didn't last very long. And the battery for Florida Panther #3 went out. And they said, oh, we need to go capture it again to replace the battery. So they went out, they used Roy's dogs. They knew, thanks to the radio collar, about where to look for it. They found Florida Panther #3, they treat it, and someone shot a tranquilizer dart that unfortunately hit the femoral artery and delivered the dosage way too fast. And the panther fell out of the tree, and it was dying. And Deborah Jansen and another biologist ran over and gave it mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which to me is a level of commitment to the job you seldom see in America these days. They were not successful. The panther died, and Chris Belden felt the weight of guilt on him. He actually personally carried the carcass out of the swamp over his shoulders, like a visible symbol of his guilt for having killed one of the few panthers that were left. And when word got out that this had happened, the public went nuts. People were very critical. How dare you do this to these animals? One of the people leading the charge to shut down the whole panther science program was Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who said, I have cats in my home. They hate collars. You should never put a collar on a cat. And so finally, the State Game Commission told Belden, that's it, you're out. You can't work on this panther stuff anymore. You can't work on panther captures. In fact, you can't even go south of State Road 60 anymore. And they brought in somebody new to run it. But the most important thing they did was they did something they should have done right at the beginning. They sent out a veterinarian with the capture teams. They said, well, we've got these scientists who are looking at the species as a whole. We need a veterinarian to look at the condition of the individual panther as they're tracking it, as they're putting the collar on it and so forth. And they picked a very interesting person to do that. Her name's Melody Relke. That's her in the dark hair. Melody Relke came from the Pacific Northwest. Now, all the panther capture team people, except for Deborah Jansen, were all guys, and they were all guys from the South, from like Alabama and Georgia, Mississippi, places like that. And they all had sort of the same mindset about this job. Melody Relke came in. She's coming from the Pacific Northwest. Her parents were artists up there who had decided that they wanted to run a farm. They didn't know much about running a farm, and they thought it was okay to have the animals inside the house. So Melody Relke grew up in this house where the animals were basically in her bathtub and her bedroom and under the bed and all this kind of stuff. But it made her interested in animals, animal welfare, animal health, and it made her a really good veterinarian. And she came here, she knew that there weren't a lot of panthers, and she knew that in the cases where there's a small population, genetic defects are a possibility. So she came in looking for that. And sure enough, she found them. The panthers she examined had genetic defects. And so she went to her male bosses and said, look what I'm finding. And they didn't believe her. They said, oh, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. You're brand new. Get back to work. You know, this is not a problem for panthers. But she insisted, no, this is really the problem. And when they finally captured the descendants of the Piper cats, the Everglades Wonder Garden cats in the Everglades National Park, it turned out, yes, it was true, because those cats did not have the genetic defects of the other panthers. They came from a different lineage, and they were okay. The Florida panthers that they'd been dealing with were not. Specifically, what she was finding, and this just blows my mind, the Florida panthers all had a kink in their tails, like a picture of a 90-degree angle in a math textbook. You see it there in the picture. The biologists who initially studied the Chris Belden's team, and they all thought, oh, that's just a characteristic of all panthers. It's no big deal. She said, no, that's a genetic defect. They're not all supposed to be like that. The Piper cats did not have the kink in the tail. And that's when they first started to believe her. Then she found other genetic defects as well. She found all kinds of things that were really, really serious, much more serious than just a kink in the tail. She spotted that they had holes in their heart called an atrial septal defect. She also found that a lot of the males, their scrotums had not descended, which meant they would be unable to breed. So these cats were in serious trouble. So at that point, her bosses finally believed her and they freaked out. And they said, okay, we need to capture every single panther out there and bring them all in for a captive breeding program. Fortunately, there was a Gainesville animal welfare activist who said, you can't take every single panther out of the wild. That's crazy. So she sued and she was successful. She got them to come to the negotiating table. They worked out a deal where they would not capture every single adult panther. And instead, what they agreed to do was only capture kittens, and just a limited number of them, just a certain number of kittens, which was a lot harder than capturing panthers because the kittens, you know, they didn't have the radio collars on. They couldn't necessarily, and the kittens kind of stay in the den. So it's not like they were roaming around. So they brought Roy McBride back in. Roy is like my Zelig. He shows up at every single important event in the book. But they bring in Roy, he and his dogs, they find kittens, they capture the kittens, they bring them in, but then they discover all the kittens they've captured have the genetic defects as well, which means if they breed, they'll pass those on as well, which defeats the whole purpose of captive breeding. Well, at this point, all the panther biologists are ready to hang themselves because they're just so upset about this. Basically, it means all this work we've been doing to try to save the panther is for nothing. They're circling the drain. So they meet together at White Oak Plantation for what they think is probably going to be the last of their panther consultations about what to do. And somebody, nobody's sure who, it might have been Melody Relke, it might have been somebody else, suggested, what if we try genetic augmentation? What if we bring in close relatives of the Florida panther from another group of pumas and crossbreed them? And maybe that will straighten out the genetic defects that we're seeing. And this had never been tried before. It was a desperate Hail Mary pass. Now, I have to tell you that this is the low point in the narrative that I wrote, but it's also the funniest chapter in the book. And the reason it's funny is because of what happens next, which is they sent Roy McBride back out to Texas to catch some female cougars. And I got to that point, I had done a lot of reporting on panthers up to this point, and I'm writing the story, and I thought, I don't think Roy's ever told how he goes out and gets the cougars. So I called Roy up. Roy's in his 80s, so it takes him a long time to answer the phone. And he's a very laconic guy anyway. So I tell him what I'm calling about, and there's this long pause, and then he starts telling me the story. And by the time he finishes telling me the story, I'm on the floor because I'm laughing so hard. I'm just going to say the words blindfolded mule and leave it at that and encourage you to read the book because it's hysterically funny what he went through to get these female Texas cougars rounded up and brought in and then taken to Florida by air. And when they got here, all 8 of them were released. That's actually a picture of one of the female Texas cougars being released out into the wild. And they turned them loose and kind of crossed their fingers and said, I hope this works. Well, while this was all going on, while the state biologists were doing their best to try and save the panther species, the federal folks were allowing rampant destruction of Florida panther habitat. That picture is actually Florida Gulf Coast University under construction. It was built right smack dab in the middle of panther habitat. And the reason that became the site for Florida Gulf Coast University is because a major contributor to political causes, who was also a major developer, donated the land. Meanwhile, he owned all the land around it and began developing everything around the college campus. And he said, oh, were there panthers out here? I'm sure there were dinosaurs one time too. He was very cavalier about it, and so were the feds. They actually were issuing these permits based on junk science. At one point, they actually claimed there were excess panthers, so it was okay to destroy their habitat. Excess panthers, if you can believe that. Finally, a permit reviewer, a very quiet guy, a guy who would not necessarily be the one to speak up, he said, I can't take this anymore. And he actually sort of threw down the gauntlet. He sued his own agency. He sued the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to stop them from issuing these permits to everybody and his brother. And he won, but he lost his job. But he succeeded. Now, I'm not going to tell you the rest of the story. You have to get the book, but there are lots of twists and turns. Among other things, there's the strange tale of the first underpass. Florida biologists persuaded the Florida DOT to start building underpasses under major roadways so that the panthers wouldn't have to cross the road, because a lot of them were getting killed by cars. Well, the DOT was like, these things are really expensive. They're like $1 million a piece. No, and we don't think any panther is going to use them. And they said, build one, we'll put a camera in it and we'll see. So they put a camera down there that was it was motion activated. And sure enough, it picked up several panthers crossing under the road. It also picked up other animals using it, including bears, foxes, raccoons, and a guy in an ape suit. We're not sure what that was all about. One thing that the feds did right, they actually bought land and created the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge down in the area where Fakahatchee Strand is. And they were so concerned about making sure that the land was devoted to panthers that at first they did not build any human structures out there, including the headquarters for the refuge. So in order to get to the headquarters, you had to go to the Comfort Inn at exit 101 and go to the 3rd floor. And that led to a lot of jokes about whether the panthers were getting turned down service and a mint on their pillow. I have to tell you that the skunk ape, the odiferous skunk ape, gets a cameo in the book. If you're not familiar, there are a number of Bigfoot relatives around the country. Florida has 2. One is the Barden booger in Central Florida, and then the other is the skunk ape in South Florida, both of which exist mostly in blurry photos and souvenir T-shirts. But the skunk ape gets a cameo as well. And I just want to mention, by the way, that the skunk ape research headquarters, that's what they call it, where you buy those T-shirts, has a campground next to it. And the campground, when I went there, I was surprised to discover that's where a lot of the python hunters stay. During the day, they go out at night and hunt the pythons, but during the day, they're camping out in the campground next to the skunk ape research headquarters. And I thought, that is so weird, because, you know, if you, instead of hunting pythons, which we have a lot of, if you went out and found a skunk ape, you'd be rich. So anyway, let me just mention a couple of other books that I've written. My big New York Times bestseller is Oh, Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country. And The Scent of Scandal, Greed, Betrayal, and the World's Most Beautiful Orchid, which is about how Selby Botanical Gardens in Sarasota wound up facing wildlife trafficking charges, all because of a single orchid brought in from Peru. That one, by the way, is the only book I know of that's been classified as true crime / gardening. I always feel bad for the booksellers trying to figure out what shelf that goes on. So, and my most recent one is a collection called The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife, which is a collection of 51 stories and columns that I've written over the last 30 years, with a delightful cover drawn by Andy Marlette, the editorial cartoonist for the Pensacola News Journal. So, you guys have any questions? Thank you. Yes, sir. Guy with the delightful hat. How did you know? He was asking if the legislator who wanted to make the gator the state animal instead of the panther was a UF grad, and I said, "How did you know?" I'm sorry, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but it's in the book. It's in the book. Yes, ma'am. That's a really good question. She's asked how many panthers there are. At the time they brought in the Texas Cougars, there were about 20 left. So obviously they're in dire straits. They think there are now about 200. So it's not a huge increase, but it's way better than it was in 1995. And so I wouldn't say the book has a happy ending, but it has a hopeful ending as a result. The book came out right before the pandemic hit, and a lot of people told me they liked it because it had that hopeful ending to it. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's correct. This young lady asked a very pertinent question, which is how did the people who saw the ape on the video from the underpass know it wasn't a skunk ape? I don't know. Perhaps it waved at the camera. Anyone else? Yes. Yes, man, I've never met.
Just want to say that Craig is the shining light of environmental activism in the state. And it's one of the few people that really stands up, confronts the governor, legislature, call it as it is, and I deeply appreciate it. It's a big help. So,
Thank you. Thank you. And Jack, don't forget to send me your bill for saying that, okay? Yes, ma'am. She was asking if we have panthers up here in the north part. They have not been seen up here, but it wouldn't surprise me any. One of them actually went all the way from the Corkscrew Swamp area all the way up to Georgia. The males tend to roam long distances, especially during mating season. And unfortunately, that one was looking for love in all the wrong places. A deer hunter in Georgia freaked out and shot him. I'm happy to report the deer hunter was prosecuted for doing that. So he won't do it again, at least. What was your second question? Oh, she was asking what the difference is between a bobcat and a panther. Bobcat, as the name implies, has a bob tail. It's very short. And the bobcat itself is much smaller than the panther. Panthers they're big. They're really big. And they have very long tails, which scientists tell me they use when they're running. They use for leverage as they turn when they're pursuing their prey, because they have very, very strong muscular back legs. They can actually jump 15 feet straight in the air. But their top speed, I think, is about 40-45 miles an hour. And they use that tail as leverage so they can make very sharp turns. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. Oh, you should also say, fortunately, you didn't hit it with your car. So that's that's the other good news. She said she saw what appeared to be a panther at the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, and she said, unfortunately, she didn't get a photo, and I said, but fortunately, you didn't hit it with your car either. So, so it's a good outcome. Mm. Yes. Yeah. They're magnificent animals. They really are. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Yes. My columns appear every Thursday on the website floridaphoenix.com, and there's no paywall. They're free to read. So and I write on environmental issues in Florida. So if you care about Florida's environment, please read my columns. The column today was about that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should just admit they screwed up when they said manatees weren't endangered, because now they're thinking about putting them back at the top of the list. Basically, I kind of roam around Florida and pick subjects. I actually wrote about Jack once. And that column is in the state you're in, is collected in the state you're in. And speaking of Jack, yes.
there are panthers up here. I've been sort of looking at. I have seen Back when I was a horrible kid at age 15, and I had just moved to Florida, I was almost shocked. If I was shooting anything, I was shocked. This was in Caravel. We were walking up the hill, and this panther came up over the hill, and I was very good. My cohort was with me, grabbed me, because we down the traffic, and in a spot. So that was fun. One of the reasons we have Kingspell Swamp is because that same, I think fishing buddy, his name is Oscar Sanders, was, across the public lands basically asked me, and I think by hand, to come up with a decision of whether or not the state should buy Kingspell. And, I was somewhat dubious, but anyway, Oscar told me, say when I was hunting with him some years before, that there was a, female with 2 cubs, and we saw the panthers there. And I also have anecdotal hatred for it to people that I chased, including a pregnant girl who was following.
She didn't strip, I hope. I should mention, by the way, I always love mentioning this. He was telling the story about Tate's Hell Swamp being designated as a state preserve. That during when Lawton Childs was governor, he actually proposed building a state prison in Tate's Hell Swamp because, and his argument was, what better place for a prison than hell? Fortunately, someone talked some sense into him and they left it. They left it the way it is. Yes. Yes. Yeah, they were apparently descended from South American pumas. Robert Bowdy is a character in the book as well. He did not approve of Chris Belden at all, and they were like this the whole time. Oh, good names. I should mention the cat on the cover of Cattail is from the Lowry Park Zoo in Tampa, and is actually still there. So, yes.
Was finished before the pandemic, so
Yes.
curious what you think about the current wildlife corridor and all the sort of the more current events.
Yeah. Let me say the Florida Wildlife Corridor, the fact that they persuaded the legislature to set money aside for purchasing land for the corridor is a wonderful thing. I was happy to see that happen. And Carlton Ward is actually a character in the last chapter of the book. I should mention that. One thing I find about it, I find rather amusing, which is that I think it's about 40% of the land designated for the Florida Wildlife Corridor was already on the Florida Forever purchase list, which the legislature didn't like. They didn't like Florida Forever, but Florida Wildlife Corridor, we'll support that. So I like that they kind of game the system a little bit like that. I believe it was this most recent legislature, Bruce, please correct me if I'm wrong, that passed a bill that said, now we're going to let people go on the wildlife corridor. Is that right? Which I thought the wildlife corridor was supposed to be for animals. So I'm a little troubled by that. Carlton Ward tells me it's okay, but I'm just a little, because anytime you mix humans with wildlife, the wildlife seem to lose out. So, but I could be wrong about that. Yes, ma'am. I have not seen the documentary. I have the book, and I have a piece in the book. But you know, anything you can do to educate people about the panther and about the need to preserve wildlife in Florida, because you know, the land you preserve for panthers, you're preserving it for lots of other animals as well that are not nearly as charismatic. You know, the various otters and so forth that live in that same territory, they benefit. So it's a good thing. You know, so I'm happy that ran. Is it still playing or not? Is it stopped? Okay, so it's still on Disney Plus, on National Geographic. Okay, So everybody go home now and go watch that. Is it? Okay, good, good. Yes, ma'am. This lady's asking me to give away the ending of the book. I'll do it. She was asking if the genetic defects went away. Yes, and as a result, there was a baby boom, and so that's why the population has expanded. And the big thing they were worried about was that this is actually the term the scientists used. They were worried the Texas genes would swamp the Florida genes, and that they would somehow become a different species or a hybrid species. And so there have been not one but two genetic tests done to find out if that happened, and they have determined that no, it did not. Basically, that the panthers that are out there now are real panthers, and there are some sportsmen's groups who are not happy that the panthers are more aggressive than they used to be, and they're upset about that and they're saying, oh, that's because they've changed. They're Texas pumas now. They're not real Florida panthers. So I asked Roy McBride about that, and Roy said, well, the only difference is now they're healthy. Otherwise, they're acting the way a real panther would act. And they were scared before because they were sick. Now they're not. So, yeah. I always like talking to Roy. Roy did not want, at first Roy didn't want to talk to me because he doesn't like talking about himself. But I said, Roy, you're my witness. You're the only person that saw some things that happened. If you don't tell the story, nobody else will know it. And he said, okay, what do you want to know? So that's how I finally got that stuff out of him. But he died recently, I'm sorry to say. But if it weren't for him, we probably wouldn't have panthers in Florida anymore. Yes. Well, there were some Texas pumas that were released around the Swanee River area. Is that what you're talking about? I don't know anything about them being released up in Georgia. And in fact, when the panther population began to grow, Florida said, well, we may not have room for new panther colonies in other parts of Florida. So they wrote to Georgia and Arkansas and some other states and said, can we bring you some panthers? And they said, no, we do not need any big predators eating cows up here. So keep them in Florida. So for now, they're all ours. It was a disaster. It was a total disaster. And well, I tell the story in the book. Let me just say that. And it was a mess. Have you ever heard of the Waldo cat? The Waldo cat was one of the ones they released, and they weren't supposed to breed, but somehow he did. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, yeah. Yes. It has some specific genetic markers according to the biologists that I've interviewed. One physical characteristic that it has that you don't really see in others is, believe it or not, a Roman nose. The nose is actually structured different from other pumas. They don't know if that's because they swim more or what, but that's one physical characteristic you and I as laymen can see. But there are other genetic markers as well. There's been some controversy because there was a U.S. Geological Survey scientist who produced a paper that suggested that all pumas are the same. And so there was then a push to try and take Florida panthers off the endangered list because, of course, pumas and cougars aren't endangered out west, and if they're all the same species, why would you say Floridas are endangered? I called the author of that paper and asked her what she thought about that, and she said, no, they're still endangered. They're endangered because of their geographic location. So in other words, they shouldn't be on the endangered list because they're genetically separate. They should be on there because it's a colony that is in danger. But in order to make that work legally, what you'd have to do is delist them and then put them back on the list, which is just a legal nightmare. So she was saying, basically don't touch them. So I haven't heard the Fish and Wildlife Service bring that up again, but we'll see. Does that answer your question? Okay, good, good. Anybody else? Have I talked y'all all out? Thanks again for coming. I appreciate it. Oh, and let me just say one more thing real quick. If you would like to do something to help panthers, the Florida Panther license plate, this being Florida, that's how we fund scientific work. The sale of Florida Panther license plates supports Florida Panther scientists. So that's something concrete you could do to help them. So just throwing that out there. Same thing with manatees. Manatee license plate, the Save the Manatee license plate doesn't support Save the Manatee Club. It supports the Wildlife Commission scientists who study manatees. So there you go.